They stripped her of her crown in the desert, thinking she would wither away in the shadows. But they didn't realize they were just setting a predator free. Amira Hamdan was a princess of Dubai, until she became a scandal the royal family couldn't hide. Banished, broke, and betrayed by her own blood, she landed in London with a singular, deadly goal. If she couldn't rule a kingdom, she would rule the underworld. Look at her now, elegant, seductive, deadly. From the drug-laden docks controlled by the Kinahans to the neon-lit strongholds of the Albanian Mafia, Amira didn't use bullets to take over. She used something far more lethal. She used the one thing men will kill for and die for. But even a queen has a weakness. While she was busy conquering empires, she led a Trojan horse into her bed. She fell in love with Julian, a man who was a master of the same lethal game. In the high-stakes world of the Mafia, love isn't a sanctuary. It's a death sentence. Tonight, we uncover the rise and the devastating fall of the woman who seduced the Mafia, only to be destroyed by the one man she couldn't control. In the heart of Dubai, where the sand meets the skyline in a shimmering haze of gold and glass, Amira Hamdan lived as a prisoner of perfection. To the world, she was a jewel of the royal household, a silent figure of grace draped in silk and tradition. But beneath the heavy embroidery of her abaya beat the heart of a rebel who found the desert heat less stifling than her father's expectations. Her life was a meticulously curated golden cage, a world of private jets and marble palaces where every move was watched by 1,000 eyes, and every desire was secondary to the honor of the throne. Amira, however, did not crave honor. She craved the friction of life. She began to find it in the shadowed corners of royal galas and the high-security penthouses of government officials. Her first taste of defiance was a secret affair with a high-ranking minister, a man twice her age who was intoxicated by her intellect as much as her beauty. She learned quickly that information was more valuable than gold, and that a man's guard is never lower than when he believes he is the one in control. The affairs became her secret currency. She moved through the elite circles of the Emirates like a beautiful ghost, collecting the vulnerabilities of the men who ruled the kingdom. She wasn't just looking for love, she was looking for leverage. Each illicit encounter was a strike against the restrictive walls her father had built around her. She was rogue, erotic, and dangerously ambitious, using her royal access to infiltrate the private lives of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. But even in a city built on illusions, secrets have a way of catching the light. The breaking point came on a humid night during the Grand Royal Jubilee. A series of intercepted messages and compromising photographs, leaked by a rival who feared her growing influence, shattered the silence of the palace. The scandal was seismic. It wasn't just a daughter's rebellion, it was a public desecration of the much-respected throne. The fallout was cold and clinical. There were no shouting matches, only the terrifying silence of her father's disappointment. In a kingdom where reputation is everything, Amira had become a liability that could no longer be managed. With a stroke of a pen, she was stripped of her princess rights, her titles, and her heritage. She was banished, cast out from the only world she knew with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burning, lethal resentment. As the private jet carried her away from the fatting lights of Dubai toward the gray skis of London, Amira didn't weep for her lost crown. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window and smiled. The princess was dead, but the boss was just beginning to breathe. The golden heat of Dubai was a fever dream she was no longer allowed to have. As the private jet touched down at Heathrow, the cabin pressure hissed like the venomous whispers of the court she had left behind. Amira stepped onto the tarmac, not into the waiting arms of a royal motorcade, but into a wall of biting gray sleet. The wind tore at her silk scarf, a final, mocking remnant of her former life. Her father's parting words echoed over the roar of the engines. "You are no longer a daughter of the kingdom. You are a ghost." With her accounts frozen and her diplomatic passport revoked, the woman who once commanded the attention of kings was now just another face in the London rain, carrying a single suitcase and a heart full of jagged glass. She retreated to a cramped, low-rent apartment on the edges of Bermondsey, where the walls smelled of damp and the radiator knocked like a dying man. It was a far cry from the marble palaces of her youth, but Amira didn't cry. She watched. She learned. She realized that the streets of London had their own royalty, and they didn't wear crowns. Late one evening, while walking back through a fog-thickened alley, the silence was shattered by the screech of tires. A black SUV swerved into the path of a silver sedan, pinning it against a brick wall. Amira pressed herself into the shadows of a doorway, her breath hitching. Two men in tactical gear stepped out, their movements synchronized and cold. These weren't common street thugs. They operated with the lethal precision of a desert firing squad. Through the shattered window of the sedan, a man begged for his life, his voice a pathetic whimper in the dark. One of the gunmen, a man with a jagged scar across his jaw, leveled a suppressed pistol. Thud, thud. The sound was sickeningly quiet. The hit was over in seconds. As the shooters turned to leave, the scarred man paused, his gaze sweeping the alley. For a heartbeat, his eyes locked onto Amira. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She stared back with a cold, royal defiance that seemed to startle him. He smirked, tucked his weapon away, and vanished into the SUV. As the vehicle roared away, leaving only the smell of burnt rubber and copper, Amira stepped toward the wreck. She looked at the lifeless body and felt a strange, dark electricity surge through her veins. This was the Kinahan Syndicate, the men who truly owned the city. Her father had tried to bury her in the shadows, but he had accidentally handed her the keys to a different kind of throne. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to find the man who pulled that trigger, and she was going to make him kneel. The London rain didn't wash away the stench of the shipping docks, but it did provide the perfect veil for a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. Amira Hamdan stood on the edge of the pier, her silk trench coat fluttering against her legs, a stark contrast to the rusted containers and the jagged men guarding them. She wasn't there to hide. She was there to hunt. Her target was Callum Kinahan, a man who moved billions but couldn't buy a single second of genuine class. Callum emerged from the shadows of a warehouse, flanked by two heavies whose hands never strayed far from their waistbands. He was rugged, smelling of expensive tobacco and cheap violence. He expected a frightened exile or a desperate informant. Instead, he found a woman who stood as if the oil-slicked concrete was a velvet rug in the Jumeirah Palace. "You're a long way from home, princess." Callum sparked a lighter, the flame reflecting in Amira's calm, dark eyes. "London isn't kind to fallen royalty. It eats them." Amira didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her heels clicking a rhythmic, predatory beat. "London eats the weak, Callum, but I didn't come here to be fed upon. I came to offer you the one thing your business lacks: invisibility." She let the silence hang, knowing exactly how to play a man who had everything but security. She spoke of the complex banking webs of the Middle East, of royal channels that bypassed every Western watch guard, and of laundering techniques that turned blood-soaked cash into pristine sovereign wealth. She used the same effortless grace that had once charmed diplomats, leaning in just close enough for him to catch the scent of her perfume, a fragrance that cost more than his car. Callum watched her, his initial skepticism melting into a dangerous curiosity. He was used to women who feared him or wanted his money. He wasn't prepared for a woman who looked at his empire and saw a project. "The UK authorities are tightening the noose on your accounts," Amira whispered, her voice like silk over a blade. "I can loosen it. Give me 10% of your next shipment, and I will show you how a princess hides a mountain of gold." Callum leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes. He thought he was the one making a deal with a beautiful girl in trouble. He didn't realize he was handing the keys of his kingdom to a woman who had already planned his funeral. As he reached out to shake her hand, Amira smiled, a cold, royal curve of the lips. The first move was made. The Kinahan Empire was no longer his. It was simply waiting for her to claim it. Amira knew that while the Kinahans dealt in shadows and ledger books, the Albanians dealt in spectacle. Agon Berisha, the feared head of the Albanians, had flooded London streets with high-purity cocaine and his social media with gold-plated supercars, yet he remained a pariah to the city's true elite. He had the muscle and the millions, but he lacked the one thing a banished princess possessed by birthright: the keys to the rooms where the real power resided. She chose her entry point with surgical precision. Amira didn't send a message. She staged a haunting. She appeared at an exclusive, invite-only charity auction in Mayfair, wearing a vintage couture gown that screamed of old-world royalty, a stark contrast to the flashy, logo-heavy fashion of Berisha's inner circle. She knew Agon was watching from the mezzanine, a man who felt the sting of every door that remained closed to him despite his wealth. When she finally allowed him to approach her, she didn't recoil at his rough edges. Instead, she offered a smile that was both a welcome and a challenge. "You have the kingdom, Agon," she whispered as they stood on a balcony overlooking the sparkling city, "but you're still standing outside the palace gates. Money can buy you a seat at the table, but it can't buy the respect of the men who built the table." She watched the muscle in his jaw tighten. She had hit the nerve. Amira leaned in, her perfume, a rare blend from the royal gardens of her youth, filling his senses. She offered him a deal that was far more intoxicating than any drug he sold. She would become his bridge. She would transform the Albanians from a street-level threat into a sophisticated corporate entity, using her connections to high-ranking government officials and international royalty to mask his operations behind a veil of aristocratic legitimacy. In exchange, she didn't ask for money. She asked for his loyalty and his soldiers. Agon, blinded by the prospect of shedding his criminal skin for the mantle of a legitimate mogul, didn't realize he was handing over the keys to his armory. As she watched him look at her with a mix of reverence and desire, Amira felt the familiar rush of the hunt. She was weaving a web of silk, and Berisha was walking into it with his eyes wide open, convinced he was the one finally entering the palace. She wasn't just infiltrating his circle. She was colonizing it, ensuring that when the time came to move against the others, the most violent men in London would be her personal guard. Amira knew that George Madden was a different breed of predator. Unlike the flash-heavy Kinahans or the aggressive Albanians, Madden was a relic of the old-school Clerkenwell Syndicate, a man who valued tradition, manners, and the outdated notion that women were to be protected, not feared. To take his empire, she wouldn't need a spreadsheet or a threat. She needed a performance. She chose a rain-drenched evening at a discreet, wood-paneled private club in Mayfair, a place where the scent of expensive cigars and aged scotch hung heavy in the air. Amira arrived not as the rising queen of the streets, but as the broken princess of the desert. She wore a modest but exquisitely tailored silk dress, her eyes expertly touched with a hint of fatigue to mimic a woman on the run. When she approached Madden's corner table, she didn't lead with strength. She led with a tremble in her voice. "Mr. Madden," she whispered, her posture shrinking just enough to invite his gaze. "I was told you were the only man in London who still honors the old ways. I have nowhere else to turn." Madden, a man whose silver hair and stern face masked a lifetime of violence, looked up. He saw a beautiful woman of high birth being hunted by the very wolves Amira herself had set in motion. She told him a curated lie, that Callum Kinahan was trying to force her into a position she couldn't accept, and that her royal father had sent men to drag her back to a life of imprisonment in Dubai. She watched his chest swell with a dangerous, patriarchal pride. To Madden, she wasn't a rival. She was a bird with a broken wing, and he was the only lion capable of guarding the cage. "Sit down, girl," he grunted, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. In this city, the Maddens don't let royalty get pushed around by Irish street thugs. Over the next few hours, Amira played her role to perfection. She let him instruct her on the workings of the London underworld, nodding submissively while she memorized every name, every route, and every vulnerability he let slip in his eagerness to impress her. She allowed him to feel powerful, to feel like her savior, all while she was weaving a digital and social noose around the Clerkenwell Syndicate. As she left the club, Madden's hand lingered a moment too long on hers, a gesture of ownership she bore with a practiced, shy smile. But the moment she stepped into the cool night air and the door clicked shut, the vulnerability vanished. Her spine straightened, her eyes turned to ice, and she pulled out her phone. Madden had just handed her the keys to his vault, thinking he was only holding her hand. The damsel was gone. The executioner was moving into position. Amira sat in the back of a darkened Mercedes, the cool glow of her phone illuminating a face that betrayed nothing of the chaos she was about to unleash. To rule the UK, she didn't need an army. She only needed to whisper the right lie into the right ear. She knew that men like Kinahan and Agon Berisha were held together by a fragile pride, a pride she had spent months meticulously mapping. Her first move was a surgical strike on the ego. She arranged for a high-value Kinahan shipment at the Tilbury docks to be intercepted, not by the police, but by a crew wearing the signature tactical gear of the Albanians. She didn't steal the cargo. She burned it, leaving behind a single Albanian gold coin she had lifted from Agon's nightstand weeks prior. By the time the sun rose, Kinahan was looking at the charred remains of £5 million, convinced the Albanians were no longer content with their share of the street trade. Amira didn't stop there. That afternoon, she sat across from Agon Berisha in a high-end Mayfair lounge, her touch lingering on his arm just long enough to make him feel invincible. With a troubled sigh, she confessed that George Madden of the Clerkenwell Syndicate had approached her, claiming Agon was becoming a liability to the London peace, and that the Kinahans were already clearing space for his replacement. She watched the veins in Agon's neck tighten. The seeds of paranoia weren't just planted, they were being watered with the finest champagne. By nightfall, the city began to scream. A Kinahan drive-by peppered an Albanian-owned social club in Barking, and in retaliation, an explosion rocked a Clerkenwell warehouse. Amira watched the headlines from her penthouse, the rhythmic blue and red of distant sirens pulsing against her windows like a heartbeat. The boss of bosses were no longer looking at the woman in their beds, they were looking at each other through the crosshairs of a rifle. As the body count rose, the syndicate's infrastructure began to fracture. They were bleeding money, loyalty, and blood, while Amira remained the only neutral point of contact for all three. She was the confidant to the grieving, the advisor to the angry, and the secret architect of their mutual destruction. The men who once thought her a fragile exile were now begging for her insight on how to survive a war she had started with a single, seductive breath. She poured herself a glass of vintage red, the color matching the carnage unfolding on the streets below. The crown of the desert was gone, but the throne of London was finally within her reach. The streets of London had become a slaughterhouse, exactly as Amira had designed. The air in the city felt heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the scent of scorched rubber as the Kinahans, the Albanians, and the Clerkenwell Syndicate tore into each other's throats. From her high-rise sanctuary, Amira watched the chaos unfold like a conductor watching an orchestra reach a fever pitch. She had leaked the false intel, sparked the paranoia, and sat back as the titans of the underworld began to crumble under the weight of their own egos. But a queen doesn't just watch the fire. She waits for the moment the flames die down so she can claim the ashes. The call went out on an encrypted line, a summons to a neutral, shadowed warehouse in the heart of the docks. One by one they arrived, battered and wary. Kinahan walked in with a heavy limp, his eyes darting to every corner. Agon Berisha followed, his face a mask of Albanian fury. While George Madden looked like a man who had seen his empire age a century in a single week. They were ready to kill each other, their hands hovering over concealed weapons, until Amira stepped into the dim light. She didn't look like a mobster. She looked like the royalty she was born to be, serene, untouchable, and devastatingly calm. She acted as the only voice of reason in a room filled with madness. "Look at yourselves," she whispered, her voice carrying an authority that cut through the tension like a blade. While you fight for scraps of territory, the authorities are closing in and your bank accounts are bleeding dry. You are lions fighting over a carcass that no longer exists. She moved between them with the grace of a predator, offering the one thing they had all lost: stability. She presented a peace treaty, a unified structure where their resources would be pooled under a single, brilliant mind that understood the global stage. She didn't ask for power. She made them realize they were drowning, and she was the only life raft in sight. By the time the sun began to rise over the Thames, the war was over. The three most feared men in the United Kingdom had signed away their autonomy. Amira Hamdan had arrived in London as a disgraced exile, but as she walked out of that warehouse, she was the mastermind of a new, unified empire. She was finally in control, and the crown she had forged in the shadows was far heavier and deadlier than the one she had lost in the desert. The air inside the vaulted, dimly lit warehouse in East London was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and cold, unspoken resentment. This was the moment Amira had envisioned since the day her royal passport was revoked and she was cast into the grey British rain. Before her stood the three titans of the UK underworld: Kinahan, Agon, Berisha, and George Madden, men who had spent decades spilling blood to protect their borders. Now, they were here to surrender them. Amira sat at the head of a heavy oak table, the flickering candlelight catching the sharp edges of her silhouette and the cold glint of the silenced pistol resting beside her hand. She didn't need the weapon. The dossiers spread across the table, containing the deepest financial vulnerabilities and family secrets of each man, were far more lethal. She watched Kinahan, his jaw tight with suppressed rage, as he slid a heavy, encrypted drive across the polished wood. It contained the routing numbers for the KOCG's offshore laundering hubs, the lifeblood of his empire. Agon Berisha was next. The Albanian firebrand, usually prone to outbursts of prideful violence, was eerily silent. He placed a set of keys on the table, the keys to the primary distribution warehouses in Barking that controlled the flow of the city's white gold. He didn't look her in the eye, his gaze fixed on the floor as if acknowledging that he had been outplayed by the very outsider he had once dismissed as a mere distraction. Finally, George Madden, the old guard of the Clerkenwell Syndicate, leaned forward. His movements were slow, burdened by the weight of a legacy he was about to sign away. He produced a leather-bound ledger, the black book of political contacts and compromised officials that had kept the Adams family untouchable for generations. As he released it, he whispered a warning that barely broke the silence. "You've won the crown, Amira. But remember, a throne built on seduction is made of glass." Amira didn't blink. She simply gathered the items, her fingers grazing the leather of the ledger with a possessive grace. She had done what no army could. She had unified the most fractured criminal landscape in Europe without firing a single shot. The three bosses stood, their silhouettes retreating into the shadows like defeated ghosts. As the heavy steel doors groaned shut, leaving her alone in the silence of her new kingdom, Amira felt a rush of cold, intoxicating triumph. She was no longer a disgraced princess or a fugitive in exile. She was the architect of a new order, the undisputed queen of the British underworld, and for the first time in her life, she was truly, dangerously free. The unification of the London underworld was nearly complete, but one jagged piece of the puzzle refused to fit: Julian. He was the youngest boss in the circuit, a rising star who had inherited a fierce, independent network that resisted Amira's Queen of Bosses initiative. While the seasoned veterans like Madden and Kinahan had eventually bowed to her strategic seduction and economic pressure, Julian met her advances with a cold, mocking smirk. To Amira, he wasn't just a tactical obstacle. He was a challenge to her absolute divinity. The dethroning was not a massacre, but a surgical strike. Amira orchestrated a ghost-buy of his primary supply chain, leaving his soldiers unpaid and his warehouses empty. When she finally invited him to her private estate for a negotiation, he arrived not as a partner, but as a captive of his own circumstances. Her guards stripped him of his weapon, but they couldn't strip the fire from his gaze. Standing in the center of her opulence, Julian looked at the marble floors and the gold-leafed ceilings, remnants of her royal taste, and laughed. "You can take the girl out of the palace," he spat, his voice a jagged edge in the silent room, "but you can't take the desperate need for a throne out of the girl." Amira walked toward him, the silk of her gown whispering against the floor. Any other man would have begged for a seat at her table or trembled at the silent threat of the men flanking her. Julian stood his ground, his eyes scanning hers with a terrifying level of perception. He didn't see a mafia boss. He saw the exiled princess trying to build a new cage to replace the old one. "You're finished, Julian," she whispered, stopping inches from him. She could smell the tobacco and leather on his jacket, a sharp contrast to the expensive perfumes of the men she usually manipulated. "Your men have folded. Your territory is mine. You have nothing." "I have the one thing you'll never have, Amira," he countered, leaning in until their breaths mingled. "I know who I am without the title, do you?" It was a spark of defiance that should have signaled his execution. In the ruthless logic of the London streets, a defeated king is a dead king. But as Amira looked into his intense, longing gaze, a look that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed armor, she felt a dangerous, familiar thrill. He was the first person in years who hadn't been bought by her beauty or broken by her power. Instead of ordering his death, she signaled her guards to leave. Hubris whispered in her ear that she could tame him, that making him her trophy would be her greatest victory yet. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. She told herself she was keeping him close to study his network, but deep down, the exiled princess was drawn to the only thing as rogue as herself. She would keep him as a pet, a reminder of her conquest, not realizing that by letting him into her inner circle, she was handing him the keys to her heart and her empire. The penthouse suite overlooking the Thames was a far cry from the stifling gold corridors of Dubai, yet Amira Hamdan finally felt like a true sovereign. The city lights glittered below her like a scattered necklace of diamonds, but her eyes were only for Julian. He moved with a quiet, feline grace that mirrored her own, a constant presence at her side that felt less like a shadow and more like a heartbeat. For the first time in her life, the high-stakes game of the London underworld felt effortless. She was no longer just surviving, she was ascending. "The numbers for the North London pickups are off," Amira, her lead enforcer, a scarred veteran from the Clerkenwell days, whispered urgently during a private briefing. He cast a wary glance toward Julian, who was pouring 2 glasses of vintage Bordeaux at the mahogany sideboard. "There are whispers that the Irish aren't seeing the full kickback. We need to tighten the circle. Julian is too close to the ledgers. He knows the root frequencies." Amira didn't even look up from her tablet. She felt the intoxicating warmth of absolute control. "The Irish are always grumbling. It keeps them sharp," she replied, her voice smooth and dismissive. "Julian has streamlined our logistics in ways your men couldn't dream of. He has earned his place." Her lieutenant stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "He was a boss, Amira. Men like that don't just become lapdogs because of a beautiful face. You're giving him the keys to the vault, if he decides to turn." "That's enough," Amira snapped, the royal authority of her heritage flashing in her eyes. The lieutenant recoiled, silenced by the cold steel in her gaze. She believed she had broken Julian. She had seen the longing in his eyes, felt the tremor in his hands when they were alone. She was the architect of his new life. Why would he ever tear down the temple she had built for him? Julian approached then, sliding a glass into her hand. His fingers lingered against hers, a touch that felt like a silent promise. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice a soothing velvet. "Just old men afraid of new ideas," Amira murmured, leaning back into his touch. She felt a dangerous, thrilling rush of hubris. She had seduced the most violent men in the UK and bent them to her will. Julian wasn't a threat. He was her masterpiece. As she sipped the wine, she ignored the cold knot of intuition tightening in her gut. She was intoxicated, not by the alcohol, but by the belief that she had finally found someone she could love without losing herself. She was the Queen of London, and in her kingdom, she decided who was a wolf and who was a pet. She didn't realize that the man currently stroking her hair was simply waiting for the moon to rise. Amira had always believed that power was the ultimate aphrodisiac, but in the quiet, silk-draped sanctuary of her penthouse, Julian was proving that vulnerability was far more intoxicating. For the first time since fleeing the desert, her guard wasn't just lowered, it was gone. She spent her mornings watching the sunrise over the Thames from the safety of his arms, convinced that her empire was a self-sustaining machine. She was the queen of the underworld, and she had finally found a king who didn't want her crown, only her heartbeat. But while Amira was lost in the haze of a forbidden romance, the cold machinery of the London docks began to grind to a halt. It started with a whisper from the Liverpool network. A massive shipment of uncut diamonds, meant to grease the wheels of the Clerkenwell Syndicate, vanished into thin air at the port of Felixstowe. 2 days later, a high-priority cargo of narcotics belonging to the Kinahans was intercepted by a tactical team that moved with suspicious precision. Amira's inner circle was screaming for her attention, but she was listening to a different melody. When her lead lieutenant, a scarred veteran of the Adams family, burst into her office with news of a third seizure, this time a £1 million laundering haul in South London, Amira barely looked up from the handwritten note Julian had left on her desk. She dismissed the losses as the cost of doing business, the inevitable friction of a massive machine. Her hubris had blinded her to the surgical nature of the hits. These weren't random police raids. They were targeted strikes on the very arteries that kept the trio syndicate alliance alive. As the cracks in the armor widened, the bosses she had supposedly tamed, Kinahan, Berisha, and Madden, began to exchange silent, knowing glances during their weekly briefings. They watched as their queen arrived late, her eyes glowing with a soft light that had no place in their world of shadows. They saw her check her phone for texts from Julian while they discussed falling profit margins and compromised routes. Amira felt invincible, protected by the heat of her new love, unaware that the cooling of her tactical mind was the opening her enemies had prayed for. The pattern was there, etched in blood and lost revenue, but Amira was looking at Julian, and Julian was the only thing in the world she couldn't see through. The armor wasn't just cracking, it was being dismantled piece by piece, right under her nose. The air inside the Savoy ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive oud, French perfume, and the cold, metallic tang of hidden weapons. This was the grand gala, the night the disparate threads of the London underworld were finally woven into a single, unbreakable cord around Amira Hamdan's finger. Every major player was there, not out of love, but out of a terrifyingly clear understanding of who held the keys to their survival. Amira stood at the top of the grand staircase, a vision of lethal elegance that mirrored her thumbnail's command. Her gown, a shimmering sheath of black sequins, caught the light of the crystal chandeliers like dragon scales. Beside her, Julian leaned in, his presence a warm anchor in a room filled with sharks. He whispered something into her ear, his breath grazing her skin, his eyes reflecting a longing that felt more real than any crown she had ever worn. In that moment, surrounded by the men who had once dismissed her as a fragile royal exile, Amira felt the intoxicating rush of peak power. Down in the crowd, the atmosphere was a tense truce. Callum Kinahan stood by the bar, nursing a whiskey, his eyes tracking the perimeter. Agon Berisha and his Albanian lieutenants occupied the far corner, their social media-ready bravado tempered by the heavy presence of George Madden's Clerkenwell enforcers. They were the three pillars of a fallen world, now forced to toast to a woman who had used their own egos to dismantle them. Amira descended the stairs, her movements fluid and regal. She moved through the room with the grace of a predator who knew the cage was locked from the inside. She stopped to exchange a few words with Madden, nodding the shadowed, looming resentment in his gaze, a look that mirrored the antagonist in the background of her own life's portrait. She didn't care. She had manipulated their markets, bled their accounts, and now she owned their loyalty. As she reached the center of the floor, Julian took her hand. The music swelled, a dark, orchestral arrangement that signaled the beginning of the end of the old guard. Amira looked into Julian's intense eyes, her hubris whispering that she had finally found the one thing her father's kingdom could never provide, a partner who was her equal in both passion and power. She felt invincible. She was the queen of the underworld, and tonight the world was at her feet. She didn't see the subtle nod Julian exchanged with the shadows. She didn't feel the trap closing. She only felt the heat of his hand and the weight of a crown that was about to become a noose. The grand gala was a sea of shimmering silk and clinking crystal, a monument to Amira's absolute grip on London's throat. Standing on the mezzanine of the Savoy, she looked down at the men who once ruled these streets, Kinahan, Agon Berisha, and George Madden. They sat at the VIP table, subdued and compliant, like lions turned into lapdogs. Amira felt a surge of intoxicating hubris. She had done what no man could. She had tamed the untamable through the sheer force of her seductive intellect. Beside her, Julian was a vision of dark elegance. His hand rested on the small of her back, a touch that had become her only sanctuary in a world of steel. She leaned into him, her voice a silk whisper. "Look at them, Julian. They thought I was a fragile princess. Now they're just guests at my coronation." She didn't notice that his hand didn't tighten in affection, but remained static, cold. The time came for the toast. Amira stepped to the railing, raising a flute of vintage Krug. "To a unified London," she announced, her voice echoing with royal authority, "and to the wisdom of knowing when to bow to a superior power." She waited for the applause. It never came. Instead, Julian stepped away from her side. He walked slowly down the stairs, every eye in the room following his descent. He didn't look back at her. He walked straight to the VIP table and took the empty seat between Berisha and Madden. Amira's heart skipped. A cold dread, sharper than any desert wind, began to crawl up her spine. "Julian," she called out, her voice faltering for the first time in years. "What are you doing? Come back up here." Julian looked up at her, and the warmth she thought she had found in his eyes was gone, replaced by the calculating frost of a man who had played the longest game of all. He stood up, but not to honor her. "The problem with seduction, Amira," Julian said, his voice amplified by the sudden, suffocating silence of the room, "is that you eventually start believing your own lies. You thought you broke me because I let you into my bed. But while you were whispering sweet nothings, I was whispering to them." He gestured to the three bosses. Kinahan stood up, followed by Berisha and Madden. There was no submission in their eyes now, only a predatory hunger. "You're not a queen," Julian stated, his gaze level and merciless. "You're just a distraction we used to reorganize. Your bank accounts, empty. Your shipments, seized by the men you thought were your allies. You traded your crown for a heart, Amira. And in this world, that's a trade that always ends in blood." The clicking of safeties being disengaged echoed through the ballroom. Amira stood alone on the mezzanine, the golden lights of the gala suddenly feeling like the bars of a cage. The table hadn't just turned, it had been flipped, and she was the only one left underneath. The grand gala was supposed to be the monument to Amira's absolute reign, a room filled with the scent of expensive cologne, vintage champagne, and the suffocating musk of fear. Standing on the marble dais, Amira felt the weight of the silenced pistol against her thigh, a reminder that even in silk she was a predator. She looked at Julian, her trophy lover, whose hand remained steady on her shoulder, his gaze intense and seemingly devoted. She felt invincible, certain that she had finally outplayed the ghosts of her royal past. "A toast," she announced, her voice echoing through the silent hall, "to a unified London." But as she raised her glass, the air in the room shifted from celebratory to lethal. Julian didn't raise a glass. Instead, he leaned in, his lips brushing her ear one last time. "The problem with playing God, Amira," he whispered, his voice devoid of the passion she had grown to crave, is forgetting that God can be betrayed. At that exact moment, the tablet in her clutch vibrated with a frantic series of alerts. In a digital heartbeat, the offshore account she had spent years filling, the lifeblood of her empire, began to bleed out. Millions of dollars vanished into the ether, redirected by a Bacta code only Julian could have planted. Amara's breath hitched as she looked toward her elite security detail, the men she had handpicked and paid in blood. The sound of clicking safety catches shattered the silence. In a coordinated, cinematic nightmare, her guards didn't step forward to protect her. They pivoted. Their muzzles were suddenly trained on her heart. From the shadows of the ballroom, the ghosts returned. Kinahan, Agon Berisha, and George Madden stepped into the light, their faces twisted into triumphant smirks. They weren't broken. They were waiting. Julian stepped away from her, moving to stand beside the men he had supposedly helped her destroy. Betrayal was total. Amira stood alone on her stage, stripped of her digital wealth and her physical power in a single, high-stakes coup. Her hubris had been the blindfold that kept her from seeing the Trojan horse in her own bed. As the realization crashed over her, the woman who had seduced the underworld found herself staring into the cold barrels of her own ambition. The queen was fallen, the accounts were empty, and the only thing left was the desperate, instinctual need to survive the night. The neon lights of London's West End blurred into long, jagged streaks of crimson and gold through the cracked windshield of a stolen sedan. Rain lashed against the glass, sounding like the rhythmic beat of a war drum, or perhaps a funeral march. Amira Hamdan gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her breath hitching in her chest as she checked the rear-view mirror for the fourth time in a minute. Behind her, the Gala was a world away, reduced to a burning memory of betrayal. She could still feel the phantom heat of Julian's touch on her shoulder, the same hand that had signaled her execution. The man she had allowed into the most guarded chambers of her heart had known exactly where to strike to make the empire bleed. Her bank accounts were ghost numbers, her loyalists were either dead or bought, and the three bosses she had once brought to their knees, Kinahan, Berisha, and Madden, were likely raising a glass to her demise at this very moment. They thought they had broken the princess. They thought they had finally put the rogue royal in her place. Amira pulled into a dark alleyway in the East End, the engine cutting out with a tired sputter. Silence rushed in, heavy and suffocating. She looked down at her hands. The shimmer of her evening gown was ruined, stained with the oil and grime of a desperate flight. The silenced pistol sat on the passenger seat, a cold, heavy reminder of the only thing she had left. She climbed out of the car, the freezing London rain instantly soaking through her silk dress, but she didn't shiver. The fire of her rage was more than enough to keep her warm. She walked toward the mouth of the alley, her high heels clicking sharply against the wet pavement until she reached a puddle. Without hesitation, she stepped into the dirty water, watching her own reflection shatter. In Dubai, she had been a scandal. In London, she had been a queen. Now she was a fugitive, a woman with no name, no throne, and no mercy. Julian's betrayal hadn't just taken her empire, it had stripped away the last of her human hesitation. She realized now that her father and her lovers had all made the same fatal mistake. They treated her like a prize to be won or a problem to be solved. Amira reached into the shadows of her coat, pulling up a dark hood that obscured her face. She looked back at the city skyline, the lights of the Shard piercing the clouds like a needle. They had left her with nothing, but in the underworld nothing is the most dangerous weapon of all. She had nothing to protect, nothing to lose, and a lifetime of secrets burned into her mind. As she disappeared into the swirling mist of the London night, she wasn't running away. She was repositioning. The queen was gone, but the predator was finally awake. Amira Hamdan learned the hard way that in the underworld your heart is just another target. She built an empire on the secrets of men, only to have her own secrets used against her. She arrived a princess, she ruled as a queen, and now she is a ghost. But ghosts have a funny way of haunting those who think they've won. The question isn't if she'll come back, it's how much blood will be shed when she does. If you found Amira's journey as intoxicating as the power she chased, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Syndicate. Smash the like button to help us bring more of these high-stakes stories to life, and drop a comment below. Do you think Julian was right to betray her, or did Amira deserve to keep her throne? Turn on post notifications so you never miss a chapter of this Underworld saga. Until next time, keep your friends close and your heart locked away.